Hey, thanks everyone for coming on this rainy afternoon to the Ash Center. My name's Archon Fung. I'm a faculty member here at the Kennedy School and faculty director of the Ash Center. Really happy today to have Ryan Streeter and Steve Goldsmith here to talk about their excellent paper, which people should check out if they haven't already. It's downloadable on the website. It looks like Steve has a few copies of it here, but maybe only enough for him and Ryan. I'm not sure. The paper is An Aspirational Path for American Conservatism. Before we begin, I'd like to say that the Ash Center acknowledges that the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Just for your information, today's discussion is being recorded and will be made publicly available on our YouTube channel, so just be aware of that. I'd like to briefly introduce my friend and colleague, Steve Goldsmith, and then Steve will introduce Ryan and then kind of kick into presenting the paper and some discussion. I think I've known Steve for about as long as I've been at the Kennedy School, which is a really long time. Have you been here like 25 years?
Yeah, 20, yeah.
20, yeah. So
not necessary to be part of the introduction.
So I've known Steve. We both have a deep interest in cities, and we've followed each other around different parts of the campus, first in Taubman and then now here, a lot of different places. I first got to know Steve out of almost a different life, which is Steve was mayor of Indianapolis, Indiana, and an extremely innovative mayor with lots of different very constructive policy moves that were new not just to the city but to the practice of urban government, and really made city governments all over much more dynamic and much more responsive. That was on the policy innovation side, and then you got into data and technology, and so been following Steve a lot in that. Steve was served as the deputy mayor of New York for Mike Bloomberg. Yes, for Mike Bloomberg. And then he was before that chief domestic policy advisor to the George W. Bush campaign in 2000. Another different area of common interest is in public service, and Steve was co-chair of AmeriCorps, or the Corporation for National and Community Service. So he's done many things, all of them very positive. And this next chapter is really interesting, kind of captured in the book, or in the paper, which I hope is a longer-term project on reimagining and updating ideas that begin, I think, with compassionate conservatism a couple decades ago, for the moment that we're in, and the moment certainly needs that. So why don't I hand it over to Steve, who will introduce Ryan.
Thanks. A little hoarse, so excuse my voice. Thanks for the kind introduction. I used to work here, but it didn't look like this at all. It looked old and run down. That's exciting and new, so nice to be invited back. I'm with Ryan Streeter, who's a longtime friend and thoughtful architect and observer of conservative movement. Ryan was a special advisor to President Bush, worked at AEI, and managed domestic policy there. He was at the University of Texas with the new institute, the Civitas Institute at UT, and remains one of the most insightful thinkers in terms of what conservatism should mean. So we're pleased to be here. And you're I don't know how we're going to do this. We're going to talk, or are you going to?
Yeah, you guys
cross-examine us, or
maybe after you make some mistakes.
All right. Before we make mistakes, Ryan is because of his AEI position, is really more entrenched in an understanding of kind of national movements. I specialize in conservative ways to pick up trash and other things. So Ryan, maybe just to begin with a few comments about what happened to conservatism, and what is a rational approach to conservatism today. What is it not? And then what in your view should it be?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having us, Arden. Thanks for this introduction. And Steve, it's good to be here with you and with all of you. I should say that when Steve and I first started talking about this paper, its first manifestation was actually as a political magazine article. And then you all kindly invited a longer form paper on it. And so some things have morphed and changed since we first conceived, of doing this. I think what we were trying to do, and this kind of gets at your question, is to try to is to understand on the political right and the intellectual underpinnings that sort of motivated what had changed that was making kind of conservative policy making unworkable. And so we say in the paper there's kind of three long paths for conservatism, which kind of come out of the years preceding when we wrote it, the changes that kind of happened in the movement. And one was just kind of what we call culture war populism, that this way in which non-economic culture war issues had increasingly come to define the agenda on the political right in America. And in my time at AEI, we built a survey center there called the Survey Center on American Life. And it's great. It does great national surveys with NORC and Ipsos and some really high quality panel data. And some of those insights were born out of that work. We just realized that over the last 5 to 7 years, when you look at just intensity of the voting public, people that identify as conservatives or people that say they're Republicans, they're increasingly motivated by culture war issues more than sort of economic issues. And so and I kind of said early on in what was criticized, but then I've seen more people kind of also agree with this as time's moved on, that even during the Trump years when everyone was obsessing with the working class and there was a rediscovery of industrial policy and wage subsidies and all these things to try to deal with working class concerns, that what we found in our survey data was that working class people, as well as like really committed Trump voters, are much more motivated by culture war issues than they were these economic issues. And it was at a time when wages among working class people were actually rising pretty high before COVID as well. And so the economic situation in that slice of the socioeconomic, we had a definition of the working class we used that we developed with Brookings. I spent a year defining the working class. It was a very think tank kind of way to do. So we just pull those people out of our survey data and look at them. And I was like, there's something else going on here. So that I think has continued to dominate the political right in America in more evident ways, even since we wrote it. And then a close cousin to that, and they overlap in some ways, is the nationalism, the kind of conservative nationalism, which was in many ways shares a lot of sentiments and kind of an ethos with the culture war populism, but has more of a policy framework to it, sort of anti-trade restrictions on immigration. But I think what Steve and I were most concerned about was the sort of comfort level that self-described conservative had with sort of very sort of top-down policy solutions from Washington, using the levers of federal policy to enact sort of conservative objectives, which is a real break from kind of the previous 40, 50 years of the movement. And then we talk about just kind of conservatism light, and when we wrote this, it was at a time quite a ways before Trump secured the nomination, and you were seeing what it was like for him to actually be falling out of kind of the public view. This was at a time when DeSantis was on the rise and Trump was in retreat, and you actually started to see more people in the Republican Party starting to talk about policy ideas again. But it was kind of like cutting spending again. It was very sort of 2010 Tea Party-ish kind of stuff, and not necessarily reckoning with the economic challenges that we face today. So I think the culture war issues, a comfort level with kind of a non-federalist approach, kind of a top-down set of policies that we would say are kind of consonant with nationalism, and then another wing within the movement that just kind of wanted to return to the lowest common denominator, conservatism, which is mostly focused on spending and the like, and not dealing with some of these issues. So that's how I think over the, how it's really changed compared to say 20 years ago, when policy ideas were emerging in an environment that kind of put federalism issues first. First and foremost, you wanted to understand, what kinds of solutions would allow people to innovate at local levels and allow states to experiment and to enjoy this competitive federalism that I think has made America sort of dynamic. to where we are now. It's a big shift, and I think those are kind of three kind of camps within the broader movement that have changed it.
So we don't want to talk too long. We do want to talk a little bit about kind of what we're for, but
Yeah.
before we get to that point, let's discuss here, Ryan, just for a second, the anger, if you will, of the folks, we'll call them, let's say maybe white males in flyover territory, right?
Mhm.
Who view themselves as demeaned, looked down on their economic prospects, whether it's employment prospects or suicide or whatever, right? There's a lot of, and then on top of that, then you have the increasing secularization of the country. So the folks who are religious also feel put down upon. So just a minute or two about how these factors you think affect this movement from traditional conservatism to this new kind of angry conservatism.
Yeah, those are good points to make. I mean, we come from flyover country,
Right.
and
Me too.
a lot of extended friends and family members that fit the description of what you're talking about. So aside from the way they show up in survey data, we know a lot of these people that you're describing, and I think the sense of condescension is real. The sense of sort of being a part of the slice of the electorate that can be kind of openly mocked or talked about is something that has created this kind of a blowback. And we see this in the survey data too. I mean, there's just low levels of trust in kind of working class white America for institutions, almost all institutions now,
Including Harvard elites.
Well, especially that.
Yeah, especially that. There's low levels of trust kind of everywhere in sort of white working class America, but especially people that run institutions. And the effects of the financial crisis are real. I mean, in the sense that people who traditionally would have thought of themselves as kind of card-carrying Republican voters, or they would have seen themselves as culturally conservative, and they always knew that they were against big government back then. Where the animus against kind of Wall Street and sort of global elites has a seedbed that dates back really to the Tea Party era. You can see this in all kinds of survey data and all that. So this has been kind of a long time in coming. And so it's a real thing, and that's what's probably most interesting in the survey data right now when you're looking at Gen Z divisions between men and women. You know that you see men really kind of trending in a rightward direction on a whole bunch of issues, and that's sort of new in survey data, where typically cohorts, whether you're a boomer or Gen X or millennial or whatever, you sort of on a lot of issues ideologically sort of trend together. You see this divide particularly with males right now, so it's a real thing. And then the condescension will extend also in some parts of the country to matters of faith too, which people take very personally. And that's been a weird one though. I mean, Trump's selling Bibles right now, and and you have this rise of, like, for the first time ever, where people identify as evangelical who don't actually go to church, which is like, it's almost like, being evangelical and going to church, we're always like linked. You could be Catholic and not go to church, or Lutheran and not go to church. But if you said to a pollster 5-10 years ago you were evangelical, it meant you went to church every week. And now you have this rise of evangelicals who don't actually go to church, and it's like a Trump kind of evangelicalism. So that's also can confound the data too, where it's almost more of an expression of nationalism.
In the paper and in our piece in Politico and in our work over the last 20 years, we've tried to think about conservatism as a set of policies that express the relationship between government, mediating institutions, and individuals. And as Ryan mentioned before, we used to think conservatism meant healthy respect for federalism and subsidiarity, as contrasted to kind of winner takes all in today's more angry form. So just a couple observations about that, and then you can react to it. So this is a little too nuanced for today's, not this, but by today's debate, but we believe there's a role for government. Our belief that the role for government is somewhat more restricted and humble than that, well, I'll call it the left, but there is a role for government. And so the conservatism we espouse is not one that says our government is our enemy. The government is the enemy. It's that what is the right role for government and how does it play vis-a-vis the rights of individuals and families and states and localities? And that means can you explicitly say that there is a need for people to have some personal responsibility, that they need to do, that there needs to be an explicit policy in favor of work? Doesn't mean you ignore those who can't work, but what is the relationship between government and those who need help, and what's those set of policies? And so we talk a little bit about that. We pretend in the paper that we have something new to say that's not compassionate conservatism. The reason we say that is because that's viewed as old-fashioned. It's very complicated for me to write a paper about why our paper is better than compassionate conservatism, since we wrote a good part of compassionate conservatism. So it's that's a little bit, but Ryan will explain how we in fact do differentiate it. So and I just want to kind of reiterate this, like, what's the role of government with, how does it help folks who need more modern training than the training systems? I mean, we can't assume that our current government is doing everything right. So what's upskilling look like as contrasted to what it's been traditionally? What do work programs look like that say that there needs to be a place for work? What about families who can't get to work? Is there a role in the government in supporting childcare and such things that give opportunity, right? Give individuals an opportunity to succeed. So we believe that you can be for a conservative agenda and the role for government, and then that role should play out where possible in a form of subsidiarity, right? Where can it occur in the neighborhood? Can it occur in the nonprofit? Can it occur in the city? Where does it need to occur in the state, and where last does it occur at the federal government? So I just want to kind of put in a framework, and this means that not every tax cut makes sense, right? The goal is to think about the size of government and tax policy and public policy as supporters of work and family. So why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, no, those are good points, and I think one of the most important threads throughout the papers, and what we're hoping that people will start to talk about right now, the political environment is such that I don't have a lot of hope that anyone will pay any attention to what is in this paper right now. But sometimes you're right for the future, and there were some interesting discussions were happening when we started this, and things have really kind of changed, during the primary season in terms of what's kind of allowable in terms of policy reform. I think the thread that's really important to the paper is the focus on, just for lack of a better term, for the little guy. That in other words, what we want to say is that some of these perceptions about what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years in the socioeconomics of America are very real things. I mean, these cultural divides are real, the inequality gaps are real. And when you're on the downside of that stuff, your lived experience is very different than people are experiencing the upper tail of it. And that's a very real thing. It needs to be addressed. But the way we come about this is looking at this at the household and individual level from a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction and fulfilling your potential. And kind of what I consider to be kind of the richest notion of the American dream, that you could actually become something better, an improved version of what you are now, whatever that might be. And from a policy perspective, what Steve and I are arguing is that when you take some of those concerns and put them forward, you get into very practical issues like cost of living issues, access to high quality education and healthcare and these sorts of things. And you have to deal with kind of the drivers of geographic inequality in the country, which are, I think, often a real result of policy failures. And from an economic perspective, when you actually focus on people that are actually maintaining companies and organizations with maybe fewer than 15 employees, you're actually accounting for about 30% of American workers. And most new jobs every year are created by new young companies. That's pretty well established in the literature. And I think that when you focus there, even as a matter of economic policy, the follow-on effects in terms of wages and jobs are actually good for many, many tens of millions of people more. And so the way that works is having a really robust appreciation for local and state policymaking. So a lot of these issues have to be addressed at that level and can't be addressed as a matter of federal policy. You can't fix the cost of housing at a federal level. That's been tried and it just doesn't work very well. And the best solutions have to do with local and state solutions and on down the line. So I think when it comes to what we're for, and you can still be for things, I think these days, try to be. That's kind of the thing that anchors the argument.
I mean,
we can talk about our various policy issues.
Right. I mean, we're about done. We'll do this by way of discussion. We do have various policy issues, and you know, each one comes with its own set of controversies. But if you think about this, if we have a responsibility to help people be the best that they can be, that they have opportunities to succeed, right? That their neighborhoods are functional, right? That they're free of fear and they're free of crime and they have parks that work. Those are responsibilities of government. Now we think a little bit about where is there too much government, where there's too little. Well, in the areas that Ryan mentioned, there's plenty of barriers to entry into those professions that are set up by local, state, and federal laws. And they come at an expense, and those expenses are often jobs. If we want to take a real flashpoint between conservatives and liberals, we'll say many of us have been involved in the support for charter schools. As what you basically say, this cannot be a fair country if we're abandoning large numbers of individuals to a public school system where the kids can't read. It doesn't work. So how about a competitive structure that produces opportunity where there is not opportunity? That's a good example of there is a role for government, public school charters. I'm not talking about private school, but public school charters in circumstances where the current monopolistic situation doesn't work. So those are kind of examples of how the policies would play out. Not everybody here would, or certainly on Harvard campus would agree with those, but those are the nature of the things where we're saying we're not going to attack government. We're going to say government has a responsibility, but it should provide that responsibility in the following manner. So those are my closing comments. You get to go last since you have more.
No, I don't have anything to add to that. I think it'd be good just to take questions and have discussion for the time here. See what's on everybody's mind.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very, very much. A lot to think about. I'll just kick it off with a couple of questions about the future of American conservatism. One is you guys are, let me say, when I read the paper, I'm thinking that the kind of economic class that you're writing for is what you have at the core of the view is kind of the small business person, somebody aspiring who has hopes and ambitions to try to do better on the economic realm, and then kind of lifting barriers and creating opportunity to advance. You know, you're thinking about a lot more than that, but just as a ideal type or something, right? Which is super interesting. So and then the view is based on developing a set of primarily economic enablements, whereas I guess both politically and then for that person or for the people in the flyover states, like how do you answer the version of Republican or not even Republican, I mean conservative politics? It's not even conservative, I don't know, right politics that is a slightly more sophisticated version of the culture war, which is kind of a Christian nationalist version, right? Is that, yeah, I acknowledge that the economic stuff is a problem, but it is about culture and a common culture that America is about. And that's what we've lost for all kinds of reasons. And the way to move forward, it's not that economy is not important, it is important, but the most important thing is to recapture that sense of values. And that will take some state action in different kinds of ways. And that's what we need to double down on, which I think is maybe a slightly more sophisticated, less reactionary version of the culture wars that I think is on offer for a lot of people in like how they want to go in right politics right now. So is it I mean, the good version, not good, but not from my perspective, but a more sophisticated version of the culture play or the economy play, and why would the economy play win?
Yeah. I'll talk about small businesses. You can talk about Christian nationalism.
It's an odd place for me to play. I'm one of the remaining 3 conservative Jewish Republicans.
Oh, I did want
to talk about Christian nationalism.
I did want to say that the first time I heard about Steve was after you were mayor, but the innovative policy was just like, I was like, wow. So he was talking about how to improve public services in Indianapolis. And, there's then a little bit less now, but then like the privatize it all side. And then, of course, the unions and the public sector and the Democrats hated that. And then Steve's idea was, well, like it doesn't need to be like, let's just have them both compete. And if the union has a proposal for how to clean up the trash or whatever that is competitive and responsive, then they get it. And if a private sector trash hauler has that, it's like, why shouldn't it be one? Why should you prejudge whether it's going to be a private sector entity or some other kind of entity that does it? That is like pretty hard to disagree with that.
Sure. You answer that. I'm going to use our comment to answer his question.
Okay. Okay. I mean, you're right that there is this kind of sophisticated development of Christian nationalism or nationalism, white nationalism, there's kind of these various strains which are very real. And, I mean, we're policy wonks first and foremost. I mean, you've run multiple elections and been elected. I've never been elected to anything. I've worked for politicians because you have to if you're a policy person. But, but as someone who's been in and around this too and tries to faithfully track a number of different sort of data trends, I also think that the nationalism plays is not very good politics. I think that showed up in the 22 midterm elections. It showed up in 2020. I mean, we'll see how it goes this time around. But an agenda that's actually focused on the concerns of Main Street shop owners is actually a pretty popular one, I think, with a broader constituency. And, where you'll see in the paper too, and where we break, very much with kind of the trend on the political right now too, is just an approach to immigration, and the idea that, a lot of small business owners and people that are starting things all the time actually weren't born in this country. And we need more rather than less of that. That's obviously out of favor on the right now. But I think that the nationalism thing is a real thing. It's a motivator within whatever MAGA means. It's a set of symbols that are based on a kind of an apocalyptic view of the future that goes beyond the famous old paranoid style of politics into kind of the apocalyptic one. And I think an accurate reading of the last 100 years would show that it's better to be reform minded than reactionary, just in terms of economic and social outcomes, as well as even if you care about winning elections, even that. So, I would just argue that the concerns of people that are getting up every day and having to make payroll and having to get their kids to school and all that stuff are the things that still matter a lot. Yeah. It's funny. I mean, and this kind of dovetails off a point that Steve was making about schools earlier. If you go back and you look at the Virginia gubernatorial election when Glenn Youngkin won, the Republican Party almost learned all the wrong lessons from that overnight. And I remember being with a Congressional Institute sponsored conference in like Williamsburg, one of these things they do where they bring all these congressional staffers down there, chiefs of staff, press secretaries, that kind of stuff. And they got talking about this, and it was clear that the view among the Republican staffers there was that he won on a culture war issue. That he won suburban parents because he attacked the kind of critical race theory culture of the left or whatever. That's exactly what didn't happen. And Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic candidate, was the one that actually tried to turn schools into a culture war issue. And Glenn Youngkin was, I'm keeping them open. And this was in the COVID era. And then parents were like, we just want the guy that's keeping them open, and that's improving the quality. And if you actually go back and look at why people voted for him, it was because of competence. It was because of schools being good and open for their kids. It wasn't because he was attacking on these issues. And the immediate takeaway from like all these people on Capitol Hill is that we just need to double down on the cultural war issue. So they just, I mean, it wasn't really hard to read the tea leaves. This was in exit poll data. It was in a whole bunch of data and in Youngkin's speech. And I'm using that as an example, I think, of kind of, you know, when it comes to what people actually vote for, it's actually those kinds of issues. And, you know, and I would also say, if you look at like Republican governors in how they perform in the bluest parts of their states, which would be the cities, really. Look at Brian Kemp in Georgia, or Larry Hogan in Maryland, Mike DeWine in Ohio, just those three, even Eric in Indiana. You look at the Charlie Baker, yeah. You look at their reelection when they got reelected, and their performance, like Brian Kemp in Fulton County, like the seat of Atlanta, increased his vote share by 28% or something like that in the reelect. And all of these very non-flashy, non-cultural warrior, very competent governors gained a lot of Democratic voters in their reelections in these very blue places. And there's a lesson to be learned there that the Republican Party certainly doesn't want to learn from, but that voters seem to actually just consistently do in all these different jurisdictions around.
Just a minute or two about the same thing. So we wrote a paper about aspirational conservatism. We didn't write a paper about republicanism, and they no longer are the same thing, right? So that's one important
to say.
And another one, similar to Ryan's comment, is that you know, I was a mayor in a 50-50 city, 50% Democrat, 50% Republican. I was a deputy mayor in a city that had like 2 Republicans out of 8 million people, you know, not very many. So I'm basically a kind of as Archon's comment about what I did with the unions, I'm used to playing in the center, right? I mean, I have my own set of policies, but I'm trying to find common agreement. Most Americans, with very few jurisdictional exceptions, agree on most things. They don't disagree on most things. They agree on most things, including many of the social issues, right? Not the most extreme positions on the left or right on, say, abortion, but even in something as provocative as abortion, there's 2/3 of Americans who kind of agree generally kind of what should look like. So the problem, I think, is that the current political system, aggravated by gerrymandering, has given disproportionate voice to the extremes. So we talk about Republicans now, so that I think you could find a place for aspirational conservatism that doesn't require you to make a concession to positions, Christian nationalism. Yeah. I want to make a caveat about that in a second, that are just not tenable. Having said that, in other words, there are positions that you don't have to try to bring those in to have to be able to articulate these points. Let me also say, I think this is one of these problems with nuance, that the average churchgoer, synagogue or mosque, who's religious, has a set of values that are important to this country, and having them feel energetic and part of the democratic process is important as contrasted to look down upon. So I just mentioned that in the same breath, because I think you can say we're trying to appeal to folks who could have a better life down the center that's about 2/3 of the public, and say, no, these views on this end are just anathema to our democracy, and they should have no part in it. And there's still plenty of room for this agenda to succeed if you had a political system where the center had more
expression. Yeah.
That's my preaching.
Yeah.
I should note, I've run for office 7 times, and there's no possibility that either party would nominate me for any office today. Right. So I just, my views are a little bit dated.
Liberating. I'll make one comment and then open it up. You guys have That is to say, I think one interesting thing that we share, though, from different political orientations is what you're calling competitive federalism is a belief in local innovation and local action. I call it laboratories of democracy or democratic experiment. We like different things about it for sure. But I think we are in a small minority with that political philosophy right now, because like if you're on the left, you think federal government can do all sorts of things for you. And on the right is like part of polarization is you want everything to be the same. And there's, you need one lever of power to do that. But
this is a huge problem. And unlimited amounts of national campaign money have made every issue a national issue. And so the ability to have a policy in one state that's different than another state is almost invisible now, right? And so this nationalization of everything is a really big problem.
All right, why don't we open it up? I'm sure lots of people have questions, comments, thoughts. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know. Say your name and then, yeah.
Tony Gatti, I'm a fellow with Harvard's Ethics Center. I'm interested there's kind of a growing movement in support of distributism as a political economic theory within the non-Trump conservative movement. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on kind of what you see as the future for that, kind of within the trajectory of the United States and conservatism, but also especially how you think that fits into your vision of aspirational conservatism.
Maybe you want to say a word more about what you mean by distributivism?
Yeah, so distributivism is a political economic philosophy coming out of the work of Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton, among others, that is really focused around the idea of widespread ownership of a variety of assets, and really avoiding the concentration of those assets for both economic and political reasons.
I mean, I'm a big fan of Belloc and Chesterton on this. I didn't realize there was a growing movement.
You want to sign up for it?
Yeah, sign me up. Yeah. The last iteration we had kind of in the conservative movement on this in the Bush years would have been the kind of the ownership society concept, which was, not exactly, in keeping with or a direct descendant of distributism, but this idea, again, looking at the household level and the individual level, that we ought to take an asset-based approach, and that means making ownership of homes, of property, of other types of assets easier for people. And I think that's always kind of a winning issue, just because of what it actually means in terms of you get into thorny political, political and economic issues. When you actually look at what you do with concentrations of ownership and power, and I think reasonably people can disagree about that, but I think it's been a long time since we've had political leaders actually talking constructively about what it means to actually grow assets in a grassroots way, and I think that is a really important issue. And kind of some of what we talk about, especially when it comes to cost of living issues and home ownership, I think one of the most interesting things of the last 20 years has been the progress we've made on housing policy in terms of agreement across the left and the right across the spectrum about what drives the cost of land and the price of housing in a way that gets us away from a subsidy model to a kind of a reform model. And there's a lot that could actually be done there to actually to increase ownership.
And just to make this even more provocative, I guess, the larger government becomes, and the more regulations it passes, the more necessary it is that a corporation reach size in order to manage the regulations and to lobby Congress. Right. So the bigger government becomes, the more beneficial it is to kind of corporate state, right? So large corporations. So that puts a damper on competitivism, and eventually it'll put a damper on the country's productivity, and then it percolates down in the way that Ryan said. So I think this concentration of power as a conservative now, right? This not as a corporate Republican, but as a conservative, these concentrations are bad for multiple reasons.
Yeah, I think Republicans like to accuse Democrats of wanting to be socialists, and Democrats will accuse Republicans of being all for the 1%, but I think it's this corporatism, which is kind of the biggest problem that both sides have kind of made their peace with, and nobody really wants to talk about these large negotiated agreements between large and powerful interests that make it very hard for new entrants into almost any sector, and that should be the project for the next generation, I think.
Although there is antitrust, I think consensus, or not consensus, but parts of the left and Lena Khan on the left,
They
maybe
wanna break
Josh
up big
Hawley
tech
on the
for different
right.
reasons. They have very similar
Yeah,
solutions on big tech for very different reasons.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, it is focused on big tech, not like Purdue Chicken or.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
My name's Jenny Hopkins. I am an ALI fellow here for a year from Denver. My career was in tech. I'm now looking at the middle of politics, which is there is no middle, as you know. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that conservatism does not equal republicanism today. But we are in a two-party system. So where does this go? How does it play out, right?
Yeah, why don't you guys want a third, or maybe you do want a third party? I don't know. I never asked you that.
Yeah. Sounds pretty good to me. I mean, I understand all the reasons why it's not supposed to work, but for the middle 2/3 of the country that Steve was talking about,
Well, I think you have to change the rules
Yeah,
of
yeah.
engagement,
Yeah.
right? The gerrymandering by definition gives, right, the representatives are, right, the election is the primary, not the general. And therefore, dot. And that affects who controls the party in that state, which affects who gets nominated for the lesser offices. So all of that is disenfranchising of independent leaning Republicans. Now, if you want to look at a good middle of the road model, I'd look at your mayor as one of the best in the country, right? Who is a center left Democrat, but governing no differently, I would bet, than I would govern as a center right Republican, and exciting a lot of people as a result of getting things done. But I don't see how I think you could get to where we want, but not so long as there's a benefit in terms of political theater. I don't see how you quite get there from here.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it takes a certain level of political exhaustion before enough localities or enough states would be interested in experimenting with something like ranked choice voting or something in the primary system that would actually shake things up a little bit. And unfortunately, in Congress, like, to change the rules of the game, that how we incentivize people to run for office, and we kind of stripped policymaking of its former responsibilities in the last 30 years. Kind of started probably in the English era, really, is just consolidating all this power at the top of the party so that committees don't quite have the same level of authority that they used to, or there used to be an incentive to run for Congress and work your way up to a position of seniority that's kind of just not there as much anymore. And unfortunately, it seems like Congress has to reform itself if that's going to change, and that's discouraging. One thing I would say, and alluded to this earlier, is that when last year, when Trump seemed to be more invisible and DeSantis was on the rise and Trump's numbers weren't looking all that good, you could actually go back and just look at like what Republicans were talking about in Congress. They actually started talking about real policy issues again. People started venturing out into the realm. Even entitlement reform even had sort of a brief resurgence in the public debate. People were like, we can actually get some of these issues under control. So there is something about the MAGA moment on the right, which just makes sort of serious deliberation difficult. But the moment that was sort of retreating for the most in the last, ever since he started running in 2015 or whatever, you actually started to see some debate happen again. So maybe we're in this time where at some point in the future it would be possible for people to find incentives to actually work on real issues. But I don't know. I can't predict that.
Yeah.
Hi, Kareem Bardisi. I think at Toronto Metropolitan University. You've mentioned a bunch of democratic reform ideas that are out there. I'm just wondering which are the ones that are most consistent with aspirational conservatism that you might be pushing. Electoral college reform, majority budgeting, ranked ballots you mentioned, bipartisan redistricting. Any of those that you think will be core to your domestic message?
On the political structure side.
Any that you reject that are kind of out there. The century's full of them. So,
Well, I think I'd probably defer to Ryan. He's better at this time. I think ranked choice voting would be one, and there's mixed results now in these bipartisan redistricting commissions, but state. I don't know if you can get there until the Supreme Court changes its position on what would constitute gerrymandering. Because it's like either side changes, it's like unilateral disarmament, which probably won't happen. But I do think that if both state houses and congressional districts were more competitive, that would have an enormously therapeutic effect on the political parties across the board.
The state level, that gerrymandering is huge.
Yeah,
The state level, yes.
yeah. I would say anything that increases competitiveness is consistent with what we're talking about, you know, so that, so yeah, particularly on the redistricting and the way we do our primaries. And that's why, I mean, that's why the ranked choice thing just introduces a certain level of competitiveness into that political process, which would probably be the kind of result that, you know, we would want to see. The competitive federalism or laboratories of democracy thing, you know, is, you know, I think the reason we've long been for that is you know, not because of federalism itself as sort of a doctrinal issue, but that it's good for human beings to have choices about where they want to go and where they want to experience upward mobility and where they want to fulfill their potential. And when you have those competitive pressures, it actually creates an environment where people have more opportunities rather than less. And I just moved back to Austin, Texas last September after being gone for 7 years. And in the 7 years it was the fastest growing city in America when I left. And I thought it was cresting then. And now, you know, everyone I meet is like moved there since I left, you know, and they're from California.
Yeah.
And so, and it is like, it is this, I mean, I've been writing about this and tracking the data for a long time on migration trends there, but just like the lived experience of talking with people at almost every social gathering I go to is amazing. I mean, this is the most beautiful part of the country, experiencing just this sprawling set of policy failures that have actually been an incredible boon to Texas as a metropolitan economy, in all 4 major metros, but especially Austin. And so it's bad for California to be losing all that talent. It's really good for Austin, Texas, and it's good for the state of Texas to be gaining all of that. And someday that might change. I mean, you know, there's other places that are growing. So I think competition in general is good, and we should have that mindset when we're thinking about electoral and political reform as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, my name is Natalia. I'm a postdoc at the Humanities Center. You mentioned geographic inequality and corporatism as problems, but do you think economic inequality in and of itself is a problem? And can you really compete with capitalism at this level of economic inequality?
With the idea that economic inequality is just generating so much anger that you can't get a hearing for lifting up the bottom middle, these kind of policies. Yeah.
Well, I have a couple unscientific thoughts. One, I think we should put a caveat on your question that relates to how Ryan started the presentation, which is much of the anger is social policy and personal slight, right? So it doesn't come from economic. It doesn't exclusively come from economics. Mm-hmm. The other part of your question, I think, is complex. I believe that the bigger problem is that the opportunities for folks at the lower part of the economic totem pole are bleak, as contrasted to the inequity between the bottom and the top. Right? It used to be, when I last looked at this 3 or 4 years ago, some of the largest places for inequity were Boston and New York, other places where the top was really high. But if you want to say what matters to the person who's working every day and for $15, $17, $20 an hour, 3 bus changes and childcare in order to get to work and back, for them, their life is rugged and their upward mobility is slight. And those things could be addressed through policy approaches. So I think you can have a better civic infrastructure if you pay more attention to providing the fundamentals of opportunity to folks at the bottom who are not earning very much, which is a different issue than, I'm not sure that it's a bad idea I'm not saying it's a bad idea for income inequality to be condensed. I'm just saying I think the bigger issue with respect to anger is how tough life is at the bottom and how bleak it is looking up. We wrote a book on economic mobility, not Brian and my spouse Kate and I. And one of the things that was particularly interesting in that book is that 55% of folks who were surveyed believed that there was nothing they could do, no program they could take advantage of that would improve their lives, right? They basically thought there was nothing the system had to offer them that would benefit their lives. Those people deserve a better break, and that can be done. So that would be where, as a conservative, I would pay attention as contrasted to the other issue.
Yeah, one point I would also make too, just on the geography of this issue, is that if you go back to the mid 1980s, so not that long ago, and you look at the 15 most unequal metro areas in the country, and most unequal measured by the distance between the bottom 10% and the top 10% of wage earners, they were overwhelmingly in the South, and they were overwhelmingly mid-sized. None of the major coastal metros that you think of, or this city, were in that list of the top 15. Now, I think the largest city in that list was New Orleans, and the rest are, over half of those 15 were metros in the South. So 20 years after the Civil Rights Act, still this legacy of racism and racial segregation, and it reflected in those economic terms. You fast forward to today, and the top 15 are dominated by the coastal cities. It's New York, it's Los Angeles, it's San Francisco, it's Boston, it's Washington, D.C. It's and so just in a generation, we've seen geographic inequality become very, very much a kind of like a class sort of like segregation sort of a thing. And what that shows too is like these are also places which are huge drivers of economic mobility, and it shows that you've got a lot of people that just cannot participate in the thriving economies that they live around. They're boxed out of it, and I think that's a huge project for policymakers. And I think it's that stagnation at the bottom. There's been econ Twitter's been ablaze for the last 6 months with lots of disagreements about the economic literature on like how much the gaps are and how much mobility has actually been measured, if it's been measured the right way, and all that. That's a fascinating debate. But I think everybody agrees that the lower tail should be rising faster than it is. And I think that it's a little hard to disentangle populism from the economic side. I'm of the school that, as Steve mentioned earlier, I think that populism is a much more cultural and social driven movement than it is economics, just for a whole bunch of reasons that I think you can ascertain in the survey data and stuff. But I think that's a huge, I feel like for policymakers of this next generation, trying to figure out that dynamic of inequality and trying to find ways to reverse it through really creative policy solutions is probably one of the most important things you could do.
One more question, Tony, and then we got.
My name is Tony Morris. I'm on the Dean's Council here at the Kennedy School. I noted with interest that the American Enterprise Institute, as you described it, and Brookings came up with some kind of common definition of working class. The New York Times as recently, I think as yesterday, in the opinion section, had an author sort of trying to look at the vectors of the elites that are now college educated versus sort of liberal leaning, and the working class that is not, and the author identified this class divide. And I'm just curious, are there some parameters that you could share with us that Brookings and the American Enterprise Institute agreed to that were sort of the attributes of the working class?
Yeah, we did it numerically in terms of like trying to define it qualitatively, culturally. We didn't. We had a lot of debates and discussions about that, and I have some other thoughts on that based on other survey data. But we had a working group, and we did this regularly with Brookings on a number of different issues, and looked at just tons of data, tons of literature, and basically came up with a definition that the working class, as we were defining it, was somebody with more than a high school diploma, but less than a 4-year bachelor's degree. So that would encompass people with associate's degrees. And then within a spectrum, at the time, I think it was from about $30,000 to $70,000 of income a year for a family of 3. So like the 20th to 50th percentile or something like that. And there was a whole bunch of reasons that went into that. So you're looking at, so somebody that has an associate's degree but successfully started their own plumbing shop and have grown it, and they're already they're making a couple $100,000 a year would not be working class, even though they don't have a four-year college degree. So it's a combination of education attainment and income. And I wish I could remember what percentage of the U.S. population that encompassed, but I have to pull up the report. I can't remember that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This was a great exchange and discussion.